Hello and welcome to the second event in our series of programs entitled Land, Liberty, and Loss. I'm Sarah Oger, the Executive Director of Humanities New York. Land, Liberty, and Loss is an exploration of our nation's history centered on the pre-revolution and Revolutionary War era that explores the historical and ongoing intersections between racial justice and the evolution of the American landscape. Land, Liberty, and Loss is our first foray into a multi-year investigation of the Revolutionary War period in the lead up to the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which is coming up in 2026. Humanities New York is a 501c3 and is the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. The mission of Humanities New York is to strengthen civil society and the bonds of community using the humanities to foster engaged inquiry and dialogue around social and cultural concerns. HNY would like to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities for funding tonight's program through the More Perfect Union initiative. To support the work of HNY, please consider donating at humanitiesny.org/support/donate. We'll give you a QR code at our closing as well in the slides. I would also like to acknowledge the viewers like you who have donated when you registered. Thank you very much for doing that. Tonight's program will be taking the form of a conversation ending around 8:15 p.m., but we'll be taking questions from the audience as we go along. Use the Q&A button to enter questions whenever they occur to you, and we'll work them into the conversation as well as making some time at the end. If there are a lot of questions, which we always hope is the case, you might see your question get moved into the answered section if it was covered already in our judgment, but feel free to rephrase it and ask it again if you feel it didn't get its due. My next task is to introduce our speakers. Melissane, Schrems, and Joe Murphy, starting with Joe, our colleague at Humanities New York. He is the director of grant making here and is a graduate of the CUNY Graduate Center, as we call it, the GC, where he earned his PhD in history. And he'll be speaking with Professor Melissane Schrems, a public historian and the chair of the history department at St. Lawrence University, where she has been teaching for 17 years. She teaches American history with a focus on the European discovery and colonization to North America and the English-speaking Caribbean. And in her capacity as public historian, she has served on the board of directors of the Fort de la Presentation Association in Ogdensburg, which is also a grantee of Humanities New York from time to time, and as a consultant with the Shelburne Museum in Vermont. She received her doctorate from Boston University. Just to remind you all that the views expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect those of HNY or the National Endowment for the Humanities. And with that, I'll turn things over to Joe. Thank you, Joe.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and thanks everyone for joining us. Professor Melissane Schrems, welcome. It's great to be in conversation with you tonight, and I know we have quite a bit to talk about over the next 75 minutes or so. But first, I wanted to give you the opportunity to make a land acknowledgement. If you could do that for us at the outset here, I think that would be ideal, and then we can converse for the rest of our time together tonight.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm speaking to you from Canton, New York, and I bring you greetings from my university, St. Lawrence University. Established in 1856, the university sits on traditional Haudenosaunee territory to which the Confederated Nations granted continued claim to the United States through the Canandaigua Treaty of 1794. And I want to be clear that this is not the entire story. And one of the reasons why we push to have land acknowledgement said is to add to the suppressed histories of Indigenous peoples. So thank you for that opportunity.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you. So let's get into it. You and I, Melissane, spoke a few weeks back to sort of hash out what it was we wanted to talk about this evening. And one thing that stuck in my craw over the last few weeks was an interesting sort of teaching device that you shared with me, and really interesting methodology. So if I'm not mistaken, if memory serves, in just 2 weeks' time, you mentioned that, you often come to class to teach about the Revolutionary era, and you're often met with students who have a very fixed sort of position on what the Revolutionary era meant, in particular for Native American peoples, Haudenosaunee in particular, in the North Country. And I have a suspicion that these positions, fixed as they are tied to broader narratives about the American Revolution, and the role of Native American peoples within it. And we'll get to those. I think we should break those down and really analyze them. But you mentioned something, this device you use in the class where you sort of invite students to, as it were, hop into a time machine and go back to this particular era. So let's just say roughly 1750 to the 1830s, or even as far as 1850, if you want to be really generous about the time period.
Yeah.
So this time machine, could you maybe share that with us? And more specifically, Melissane, what does the time machine device allow you to do when you're introducing this era to students who come in with fixed interpretations of the era?
Okay. Well, thanks for the question. Let's see if we can get into it with my answer. So first, the time machine. As any of you who are watching this, I don't imagine anyone's doing Zoom just for the sound, but for those of you who are not, I am an American of African descent. And so most of my students, when they come into an American Revolutionary course, and it's a very popular course, expect to see someone that does not meet my demographic. I've only had it happen maybe a couple of times that people have come in and gone to older looking students, usually white and male students, thinking that they might be the professor. But also the time machine is really useful in always connecting the now to the then. So in some ways I see myself and my students as practical historians. And so some of the information I give them will help them in the past. So there's this idea, a lot of times people have like an icebreaker where they say, if you could go back to any time in history, what would you do? Who would you meet? Who would you talk to? And one of the things that happens a lot, I know for myself as a person of color, and before I was a historian, would be like, that is a ridiculous question. I need to frame my answer in a way that I am not enslaved, that I am not oppressed in some way. And so really, let's not go back any further than maybe a couple of hours ago, just so we can be sure nothing happens. And as a historian, I realized that that's really not the case. I can go in this time machine anywhere, and not just because it's fantasy, but the history will bear it out. So if I am a person of color, whether I'm Black or Indigenous, or anything that is not white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, I can be there because there is a group that already knows me. If I were to appear in Boston in the 1700s and I came across someone like Sam Adams, he's not going to be shocked at my existence. He's not going to have to be sort of read into how is this possible. He's also not going to assume that I'm an enslaved person, that I have a whole backstory. And I find certainly with students like myself, like I was then, it really opens up the idea of the early Republican period and the colonial period that comes before it.
That's so interesting. Yeah. I mean, in our previous conversation, you had said that the time machine allows you to open up space, right? Like to sort of push back against these dominant narratives that crowd out what actually happened and what lived experience was like at the time.
Yeah.
So like, just to take that idea, the space concept, what is the need here to create space? Why do we find ourselves so cramped when we talk about this history?
I think for one thing, excuse me,
Sure.
I've got a little bit of a beagle issue. Okay, I think all right. But for me, I find that it makes space because a lot of students can't see themselves there. that American history, and certainly the American colonial period and the founding, are often portrayed in, we say, the master narrative or the dominant narrative, or what the historian Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz would call the consensual national narrative, as a place where there are no people of color, that they are, they are enslaved or they have been conquered in some way. And so the main characters are not them. And I find that with my students who are students of color and students of European descent, many of them, if they are not descendants of sort of signers of the Declaration or something like that, which I have taught a lot of students who are descendants, I never thought I'd get to do that. But the rest of my students are sort of, this has nothing to do with me. Why is it important? How could anything be interesting that happened so long ago? And the example for me has always been, and we talked about this, is how I even got into this time.
Yeah.
Like, why am I studying American Revolutionary history?
Right.
The American founding is so important because I feel that no matter where you are in the present, people always sort of hearken back to that history, whether it is based in fact or perception. And so it really comes down to a way of belonging. And when most people see the American founding or the American Revolutionary period as a particularly European descended or European space, that sort of locks everybody else out of it. And it's because I believed in that so much, the fact that it was primarily and foundationally a white space is sort of how I lost the bet, which got me to where I am right now.
Yeah, could you tell our audience about that bet and about more broadly how you arrived at where you are today, which is as a historian of the American Revolutionary era, of American history, and of the North Country in particular?
Okay, of course. I studied as you mentioned, as you heard, that I got my doctorate from Boston University. One of my first advisor was a historian. You probably have never heard of him. His name is Alan Taylor.
Oh, no, I don't know.
Yeah, he's an up and comer. He tries real hard, and one day I'm sure he's going to make it.
One day.
One day. But he was my advisor, and he wasn't my advisor then. He was one of my professors, and I had come in to take American history. I decided I wanted to do my doctorate in American history. I hadn't really chosen an era, and he had suggested colonial America. And I really thought at my early 20s that I knew it. I was born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts. I had left in my earlier years. I moved to Washington, D.C., and so I had the whole federal thing down. I understood how everything worked. And what I didn't realize then, but know now, I am sort of the same age as Black History Month. So I had 20 something years of Black History Month. So I knew all the people that he was going to talk about. And I told him, I said, look, I don't want to take your class. And this is why I'm not taking your class. And it's because I know everything about it. And number two, your class meets very early in the morning and I'm a commuter student, so I'm not doing it, right? And he said, okay, what if I told you one thing about people in the colonial period and it was something that you didn't know, would you take my class? And I still am stunned at the fact that I even agreed to this, but I said, sure. And in fairness, he had not won any awards at that point. Okay, so, but still, he was my professor in my grad school program. And I said, sure, fine, whatever. You say the thing, and if I don't know it, I'll take your class. And he said, I'll never forget it. He said, do you know who Crispus Attucks is? And I said, yeah, sure. First person to die in the Boston Massacre, of African descent. Yeah, I got it. Nice try. And he said, what if I told you if Crispus Attucks was Wampanoag? Completely blew my mind. I had not considered that. And the fact that he knew that, and I did not know that, left me speechless. And the very next words he said were, don't forget, class starts on Monday, class starts at 8. And that was it. And so I had to take the class. And in that moment, in those few minutes, I was I don't know, poleaxed by the idea of a really inclusive history, that I had been born in Boston, thought I knew colonial America, and never even considered that there would be representation there, that I wasn't somehow an outlier. Because in most of the things I had seen, and this is in early days of the Black Heritage Trail in Boston, but in most of everything I had seen, I just wasn't there. I remember telling him, why would I get up at 8 o'clock in the morning to learn the history of white men in powdered wigs and tri-cornered hats while they limp along playing the piccolo and waving an American flag? And he had an answer for me, and that changed everything. And I recreate that in some way with my students over and over, that they know that they want to learn history. It's not the early American, it's not colonial, it's not the American founding so much, because they feel they know it. And then I just tell them a few things they don't know, and then I got them. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was talking with someone the other day about this because your conversation with me was so intriguing, and it left me with so many thoughts. And I used the word revise. I said, I think going forward, historians need to revise and even perhaps replace the standard narrative, which again, we'll get into in a minute. And my friend, she turned to me and said, replace or expand, right? So I wanted to sort of turn to you now and pose that same question for you as a historian. Is your sort of task as you see it to revise and replace a standard narrative, or to complicate that narrative by expanding the frame of view of the past?
Yeah, I would definitely, I'm on team expand. Absolutely. I don't see the point, and I have some of these discussions with my students at St. Lawrence. And I'm on sabbatical right now, but I know when I go back into the classroom, there will be questions around Thomas Jefferson. Like, what are you supposed to do with a historical figure that is crucial in the understanding of the American founding as a narrative? Are you supposed to just write him off because he has been said to do or found to do things that you find abhorrent? And my answer is no, because if you do that, there is no history. That no one is creating the history we read with an idea towards, in the 21st century, college students will read this and be really proud of me. Says no one. So, you need to go and meet them where they are. There is a question that I learned from my elders, or really because of having to explain my actions to my elders as a young person. And the question was always, in what way was whatever transgression I had done, at what point was that a good idea? And I don't know what the statute of limitations is, so I won't go into the particulars, but I remember that. And I tell my students all the time, when it's something that you can agree with, and you know that they do it anyway, there's a reason. They believe something, and you need to find a way to understand in their mind, how does that work? And so it puts me in some really interesting discussions in class. I've been in positions where I have to explain why human trafficking is so lucrative in the 18th century. Why someone would go all in to buy and sell human beings, and why it does not surprise us that this happened. But not being surprised doesn't mean we accept it or say, well, for me, that, it was a different time, everything's different. No, there's a particular time, not a different time. And we want to know, once again, in what way is this a good idea for you?
Excellent point, profound points, I should say. And I want to remind our audience that we are, of course, inviting questions. So feel free to drop questions into the Q&A function. I'm sure if you're anything like me, you have 1,000,001 questions just from what you've said in the last few moments, Melissane. But now might be a good time, Melissane, to turn to what we were calling the master or dominant narrative, and really pick it apart. The reason I want to do this is because the dominant narrative sort of, I don't know, maybe you can help me with this. It sort of seeps into conversations implicitly and dominates the frame of any conversation about the founding era. And that's true of any period in history, but it seems particularly so with regard to the founding era and to the revolutionary era, broadly speaking. So I certainly have my own definitions of what the dominant narratives are, or whether there's one or more. But I was wondering what, in your view, is the dominant narrative today about in particular here, the Native American role within the American Revolution. And you mentioned Professor Dunbar Ortiz, and perhaps there are others to draw on here. But let's really look at this carefully so that we can talk about what actually happened in the history rather than the myths that so often come to the fore in our public discourse.
All right. I think part of that narrative, consensual national narrative, which Dunbar Ortiz, I think she creates a space in which people agree to it. Yeah. And people, you don't sign off on it, you don't vote on it, but it makes a lot of sense. Right. And so people are like, yeah, that makes sense. And they don't really sort of pick it apart unless you're studying history or reading history. You don't really have that moment where you want to not only see behind the curtain, but get behind the curtain and change some things. Right. So I think the dominant narrative is that the founding, let's say the American Revolution, is this really, and I feel like I'm going to be disrespectful, and I don't mean to be, but it's perceived as this preordained thing because the people involved, the rebelling colonists, are these really exceptional people. And when I say that they're not exceptional in that way, it's not that I don't respect and honor that. I tell my students, when we put them on pedestals, you sort of take away some of the amazing thing that they did. If you or I were to start our own country and it lasted as long as the United States, that would be a big deal. When people start talking about, well, they had no choice and they were the best people and, people just smiled on it, then it becomes this way of it's not as amazing as it was. And so I like my students to understand not just the founding fathers, but the founding fathers in situ, where they lived, what they did, and what average people are doing. Because I say, if you could only gather the founding fathers together, that's not enough for a revolution, not at all. But something that speaks to so many people that they want to do it. So that's one. That's when it actually happens. But the master narrative is created over time. So it's not just how the people felt then, but what that founding means to generations of Americans going forward. And then actually does change a little bit. There are schools of thought surrounding the American Revolution, sort of, from Whig into sort of nationalist or consensus history and things like that. But for people who are more volunteer audiences, people who are just Americans who read and understand and care about these things, the American founding has in some ways sort of a biblical power that whenever you go to it, it has something to speak to your situation. And what I found in looking at Haudenosaunee and particularly Ganawage Mohawk interaction or them working and fighting in the revolution. Sorry, I think I just stepped on my dog. Sorry. All right, but he's fine. But in the revolution is that the American Revolution becomes this thing that nobody helped. That Americans seeing a wrong, righted it against great odds. A ragtag group of misfits finds a way to upend the status quo, change everything for the better, and they are made better, and the world is made better because of it. I've been an American my whole life. I don't have as much problem with that as people might think, but that's not history. It's nice that we feel that way. I think we should, in some instances, feel that way. But in the history, there are more people involved. And for us right now, looking at this particular time, we're focused more on Haudenosaunee, on Indigenous people, but in New York State, let's call it what it is, especially up here in the North Country. It's Haudenosaunee territory.
Mhm.
You cannot have a useful narrative without considering Haudenosaunee involvement. And it is pivotal. It is not the kind of involvement that is sort of an, what is it, like it's not the thing that you would have that's like a sidekick. I gave a talk on Friday at SUNY Plattsburgh, which was amazing. But one of the things I got to say was like, they're not, Indigenous people, Indigenous nations are never sidekicks. They do not come into the narrative in order to help the main characters, do whatever they want to do. Indigenous people, Haudenosaunee in this case, are there because they have their own concerns. And what in the sort of master narrative, people sort of forget or don't understand is that the Haudenosaunee are a confederacy. They are a confederacy of nations. They are just as complex as any other nation. You're looking at the North American or one of the North American answers to Europe. So it's not, some Indigenous people who really hang out a lot together and have certain culture, but really aren't at the same level. No, that is not the case, not with the Haudenosaunee. And so they have an option to help or not help. And you see that certainly in earlier centuries and the earlier century. And so when we get to the revolutionary part, the people who are involved have done it with clear minds. They just don't, we're sitting around waiting for someone to point us in the right direction. That is not the Haudenosaunee motive. And within that, within certain nations, certainly I'm looking at Mohawk Nation, looking at Akwesasne Mohawks and Ganawage Mohawks, they're not a monolith. They're not a monolith. And sort of go back to that idea about, being tricked, or Alan did not trick me, but being surprised by the information. I had a student when I first started teaching who's Mohawk. When I explained to him, or I started talking about Mohawks who fought on the side of the Patriots during the Revolution, he had to stop me because he was like, look, you must be wrong. That is not a thing. And I had to say, it really is. And we talked after class and I blew his mind. He just was, why did I know this? I'm like, well, you know more than most people do about this, but it's not part of the master narrative, because the master narrative really pushes this idea that it's all done on its own, and that there's no sort of political usefulness to anyone who is not part of sort of the starring cast of this.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this gets back to the question of how, of space and the way in which these narratives, these dominant narratives, sort of seal out nuance and deprive the actual history of all the oxygen that it had at the time. So it not only does it erase the prospect of change over time, which is something you hinted at a moment ago and that we should return to, but there is a kind of fatalism baked in, whether it's the sort of pat triumphalist approach, which is, the march of progress and nothing else, or the more pessimistic variant. These are essentially two sides of the same coin, which is a kind of fatalist onward process, grinding sort of structures that have no room for human agency. So let's return to agency in a moment. But I do have a question here for you, Melissane, and I'll try my best to answer it if I can, following you. This is from Sarah Mashiet. Thanks, Sarah, for your question. Sarah's an archaeologist and historian. And whenever impossible, she includes the descendant populations that her research is about at certain historic sites. Sarah writes that this has been praised, and yet also it's been criticized. What do you, Melissane, think about the participation of descendant populations in the way that history is presented at historic sites, in particular, a major component of the public history apparatus in this country, in particular in light of the current controversy at Montpellier? I'm not familiar with that last reference, perhaps you are, Melissane, but in any event, that's the question.
Okay, I think it's crucial, actually. There's a lot of discussion in sort of American history and Indigenous history by non-Indigenous people about like creating a space, then taking it over, right? So, we really must hear about this history, but we're only going to listen to people who've gone through our same formal way of getting to it. And we're not going to depend on anyone else, which is not helpful at all. And as a historian, I have, I think, a natural aversion to the living and the descendant. And here's why. I'm never, other people are better at this. I'm never as careful as with your grandma and your great-great-grandma as you would have been. And so, if I find out something that's like family shocking, I'm like, great, it's something that happened, I should write it down. And they're like, no, we don't want to know about that. Or it's not that way because it's just really hard for us. And I think of the Thomas Jefferson descendants with something like that, the way they are dealing with it versus the way that, public historians are dealing with it. But I do think it's very important. And I think it's I don't know, shameful. It's not shameful, but it's counterproductive that I do believe that the descendants should be consulted. That said, it doesn't mean that I wouldn't want to go forward, but certainly with things that are sacred or private, then that's it. For me, that's just it. I think the fact that the Smithsonian had to be bargained with to return the remains of Indigenous people, that's ridiculous. That was wrong. And I would never be part of something like that. And when I go to those sites, I do feel better knowing that there is that kind of input. And they don't have to be professional scholars. It's what they know, it's their history, and I think it should be included. I think it's crucial.
Fantastic. And for my part, I'll say I agree. I have another question here before we open it up to questions about agency and structure and how to sort of navigate the two as history writers. First, a question from Ray. This is a very sort of broad question, and I'll try my best to sort of situate it within the conversation such as it is now. So Ray asks, essentially, why study a particular historical period to make the kinds of points that we're talking about here? It just feels like such an important topic about myth versus history and how to tease out the differences between the two. Ray is wondering, is it even fair really to pick a specific era or timeline to emphasize, or perhaps is it more important to just tell a really broad story about patterns throughout human history rather than a specific era? So just to put a fine line under this, what are the benefits of looking at the Revolutionary era, which may seem very long, but is quite short in the grand scheme of things, for drawing out implications like the kind we're discussing tonight?
Well, on the one reason is it's what speaks to me. So it's the area that I want to study. Right. I'm always asking sort of, how did we get here? And when people sort of point back to the American founding and talk about how founding fathers felt and what the people were like, I find myself wondering, really, is that true? Let me just take a quick look. And I've been pleasantly surprised. And sort of the way the master narrative is presented, like I said, doesn't always sync up with the history. For New York history, I'm someone who really enjoys growing where I've been planted. And since I work, I've been fortunate enough to work at St. Lawrence University, I wanted to know. And one of the things that my students, one of the things that shocked them, I taught a course in the War of 1812 for a while, which, is sort of early American. It's a, Federalist, a Republican. It's a Republican period, right? We're still in there for 1812. And for them to know that New York was one of the most problematic states that New Yorkers were, we're militia, we are not army, we are not fighting Canada, we are not doing a lot of things. And that's the first war as the United States, it's the first war. And one of the first things New Yorkers did was protest it. So for my students seeing it kind of go, oh my gosh, we protest wars, or wars have been protested since then. Why do we only talk about the Vietnam War? Why is that the first war where people say, oh, look, Americans protest? And I would say, no, pretty much every time there's a war, there are people who are protesting it, and there are people who are for it, and you should look out for them. So for me, it's what you're interested in. I think Ray, I think you're right that it should be more broad, but what we do in history is we have something called the discourse. So I go on my patch and I study colonial America and the early Republican period. Then somebody else studies later, or studies what I study, but in a different way. And so the discourse is really hundreds, if not thousands, of historians writing over time and subject. So for you who are reading, then that's great. And for us who are teaching and reading, also great. But you won't find most people willing to go over the entire timeline and go broad. That's a lot. And you see that the most probably in textbooks. And when you look at textbooks, it's a team of writers. It's a team of historians who go at a textbook.
Yeah, it really does become a practical matter about how much one person can do in a given day, week, month, and lifetime. Yeah. So absolutely. We have more questions coming in, and I want to let everyone know again that we're welcoming questions. We'll set aside 10 minutes every now and again to share out those questions. But first, I do want to set aside time here, Melissane, to talk about one of your historical actors that you've been focusing on lately, a figure from this period, I believe, roughly born in the mid 18th century and died in 1814, and that is a person known as Colonel Joseph Louis Cook of Mohawk Nation, and with apologies for my pronouncement, his Mohawk name was Ekiaton-Hanquin. And so let's focus on this character, but with a view to agency, that is Native American agency, creating space, right, to look at this character and perhaps use him for instrumental purposes for the moment, to talk about nuance in the actual history, as opposed to the myth that tends to crowd everything out. So if you could, maybe tell us a little bit about Colonel Joseph Louis Cook, and then we'll follow up with questions after that.
Okay, well, first of all, it's the difference between the two of us as historians. So it's even his name. So I refer to him as Achiritar Harangwen Louis Cook, right? And in the course of me doing research, magically think everybody knows that, and my family knows that. Now, my Mohawk I am not the person I would say to follow how I say it. And from people who have taught me just a few words, because I live up here, I know that when I'm not paying attention, my Mohawk has a very distinct mid-Atlantic accent, because that's where I lived a lot. So that's interesting to me. So Atiriton Harangwen Louis Cook. I don't use the Joseph because in a lot of the writings, the Joseph is left out. I pronounce his English name as Louis Cook and not Louis, even though he was originally thought of as Louis because of his allyship with the French. And then when he is discussed or written about by Americans later, is actually written like Lewis and Clark, right? So he goes from Atiriton Harangwen Louis Cook to Atiriton Harangwen Louis Cook. And the Colonel part is definitely part of his name. And really, once again, looking at descendants, his descendants are around, and more questions for them, but it seems that his name was Colonel long before he gained the rank of lieutenant colonel in the Continental Army. So there's like a lot of stuff just in using his name, right? Just breaking that part down, which I found fascinating.
If I may, sorry to interrupt, but I do find that, as I mentioned a couple of weeks back, just absolutely fascinating, that the sheer care you take with looking at each word in the historical record of the name. And could you tell us a little bit about why it matters to retrieve one name and use it in contemporary history writing rather than another?
Well, for me, the Mohawk name is the one that usually gets left out because people are afraid, people who are not Mohawk and do not speak Mohawk are afraid they're going to get it wrong. And so we want to say, I spent a lot of my life getting languages wrong. So, and people are still sort of able to understand me. And I find that to make that effort is everything. So I like to use his entire name when I can, because it reminds me that this is not Louis Cook. This is not someone named Louis Cook, right? This is not anybody. This is a Cheriton Harangwa and Louis Cook. There really isn't another one. So, I look at him, that he's born Abenaki, his father is of African descent. He, and his mother are, adopted into the Ganawage Mohawk community. He is allied with the French. All of these things are, available to me by just looking at his name. And so when I did get to the part where Eleazar Williams, see the English names, right? But when I get to him and he starts writing Lewis, and I think, oh yeah, that makes sense, because you would never consider his French ties, and it's also a switch because when he becomes Mohawk and he's in Ganawage, he converts to Catholicism, which you and I talked about, I feel is an accommodation. His descendants make that clear. It's more of an accommodation for him, but he becomes Catholic. And then when he's Lewis, it's giving me more of a Protestant feel. He's more of an American and a patriot. And, even though this is not the case, the master narrative would have you believe that there are no Catholics, there are no Catholic patriots. So of course he would have to be Protestant.
Right. So I do want to open up a conversation about Louis in terms of agency, but of course, to really emphasize and highlight his agency in the worlds in which he lived, it would help to highlight as well the constraints, the structural constraints that he faced throughout his life. And I can think of a few, though I'm not an expert in this particular period. It does seem to me that in terms of key structural constraints, a person like Louis Cook would have faced dispossession of land by sort of on the ground settler incursions and violence, often, of course, state violence justified by the laws of the colony and later US federal and state law, exploitation of labor and resources, of course, attempted erasure from the cultural memory of what constituted, quote unquote, the nation. And, shooting through all of that is what modern minds would call racism. I would imagine that this comes into play, though we want to talk about this, the danger of reading modern notions of racism back into this era. We'll get to that, I hope. The thing is, though, I don't even know if I'm correct in saying that all of those obstacles actually existed at the time, but I suspect that in one form or another, in Louis's early life and during his post-revolutionary life, he faced, one form or another of those obstacles. Let's start in the era prior to the revolution, a period that some historians have referred to as characterized by a middle ground, something we talked about with Alan Taylor at the last event. I'm not sure how much weight you put in that term, middle ground. But I wanted to talk about the obstacles that Louis faced in his sort of life up to, say, 1763, in the beginning of the American Revolutionary conflict, and how he navigated those obstacles, and sort of the ways he was able to navigate certain obstacles in his early life. Maybe you could give us an example or two. I know that he sided with the 7 Years' War. Maybe we could get into that example as enlightening of some of the constraints he faced and how he navigated them and exercised his own agency.
Okay, can you hear me? I can't. Okay, you hear me? Okay, can you hear water running? No?
No, you're
Okay.
good.
Great.
Thanks for asking.
Okay. Let's see. Well, he was born in 1737. His family was attacked in Schuylerville in the beginning of King George's War. And it's that attack that makes him and his mom travel to Ganawage with the Mohawks. And so in that attack, they're captive. And what is interesting to me is that the reason one of the French, so and King George's War is one of the French and Indian Wars, and the sides are French and English, and the French come, attack Schuylerville, Atiriton Harangwin before, he and his mom are going to be captive, and this officer says, "Oh, look," and I put this in quotes, he says, "Oh, he's a Negro," you know, so like he's up for grabs, like clearly, you know, this is contraband, I can have him. And his mother, you know, says, "No, he's my child, you cannot have him." And the officer is like, you know, basically, I'm thinking, I don't care. But she appeals to those Ganawage Mohawks, and I don't know what happens, but that French officer stands down. And the next thing we know, he and his mom are on their way to Ganawage, and he becomes Mohawk. He's converted to Catholicism. He learns to speak French. So, you know, you could say, like, is it really a choice? I think it was. And he made the best choice possible. I mean, but his mother made the best choice possible. His mother dies, and he stays on, and he is like an attendant or an assistant to a Catholic missionary, like a priest, right? And so in that time, he not only sort of is indoctrinated into the Catholic faith, but he also witnesses the works of various elders in Ganawage. He sees that, you know, and so he learns a lot of wisdom, a lot of knowledge and a lot of wisdom. And he takes that with him because it really becomes part of who he is. His descendants remark that he's fine with all types of Christianity. He just really likes Catholicism. He thinks it's the nicest looking. I don't know exactly what that's supposed to mean. But it also leads him to be more in tune with the French and their idea of what the colonial frontier should look like. And I think part of that is because the French never make any real claim to wanting to live there or here, because I'm sitting in New France, right? Never want to live here. They really want to use it for its economic value and to form partnerships, right? And that seems to be a much better way to go than the English, who want to stay and displace indigenous people. So he's so involved in that by the time the French and Indian War happens, he's 18. He is a staunch French ally. He finds himself, or he is, and fights on the side of Ganawage. As Ganawage fights on the side of the French, and he's just so committed. Like I'm so much more interested in this right now. Like I think as going back and forth, I started thinking, like, I would really like to do a larger project. Like this is starting to really interest me. But he is so committed to being a French ally. that when the French lose in the French and Indian War, he is as distraught as any French soldier would be, because he sees what this will mean for him. And I make this point, he is distraught as any French soldier would be, but not because he's a French soldier, because if France is not there, then we're looking at the English model. And the English model is going to demand a lot, and it's not going to have room for the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. It's not going to have room for the Mohawks. It's not. And when you look at it, the way that French allied people are converted into Catholicism is much more workable than the way that they are converted into, what are we calling it, Congregationalism or American Protestantism. Like, there's much more room in Catholicism for that. And so he's not for it. But what he does, and there are three things that happen at the end of the war, French and Indian War, that he's aware of. And some of this, my students would probably put this under a list of duh, right? So some of this is, there is a Pontiac's war is happening, not a rebellion, but a war. And even though Haudenosaunee are not listed in most people's understanding of it, it actually falls under something that Ganawage and even Akwesasne warriors, if not involved in, which I don't see that, but they would not be against it. Having the Western Confederacy under Pontiac actually win that would not have been a bad thing. The other thing is that the English, as winners, draw the proclamation line of 1763 and effectively box out all the colonists. And then colonists are incredibly distraught by this. And then I imagine, as they're being so distraught about how this is unfair, at the same time, they have the English turn around and, to strengthen the tariffs, and then to sprinkle in some new taxes too. And so by the time we get to 1775, these colonists, many of whom fought on the side of the British because they were British, they were English subjects, certainly the ones who are ready to rebel are much closer to Atiriton Harangwen and other Ganawahig Mohawks. They're more in that mindset. And that leads him and others to decide that they will side with the Americans on this one.
Yeah, this development is for me, and I have to suspect our audience, one of the more interesting turns in his life. But hearing you now elucidate the experience or his experience during the 1760s, in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, it makes a little more sense. But please continue. Why does Louis side with the Patriots during this essentially British constitutional civil war between two sides of the Atlantic?
Well, it's interesting. Well, I'm gonna say I'm always gonna say it's interesting. I'm sure my students don't miss that. I'm always like, it's interesting and it's really neat, but I have them held captive in my class. So of course, what am I gonna say, right? But that as this happens, that things are changing over time. So when you look at, Atiriton Harangwen, Louis Cook in the French and Indian War, those American colonists see themselves very much as English. And it really is in that in-between time that they begin to reconsider. And they do not consider themselves to be American in the sense that, by 1764, we're going to rebel. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. They are thinking that other Englishmen have lost their way, that the Americans are the true Englishmen because they know how things should be.
Right.
And then they see how the people in charge, really Parliament, even though the king takes it, don't seem to care. They do. There are members of Parliament who are staunch supporters of the Americans, but as a whole, not so much. And then to see these little things happening where someone brought up a while ago to me, like the Sugar Act. If you look at the Sugar Act and you just look at what it says, it's not a problem at all. it actually lowers the cost of sugar. You're paying less than you were before. So you should be happy, Parliament says to Americans. But there's a backstory. The backstory is now if you try to circumvent that tariff, you're going to face court. You're going to face time at court. You're going to go, not time at court, but you're going to face legal issues. And you're going to be on trial. And you're not going to be on trial with a bunch of your friends in the dock saying, don't worry about it. You're going to be on trial with people who are going to definitely find you guilty. And for myself, you said, well, that is sort of the favorable balance of trade. That's how it's supposed to work. So, as I would say, as a very young me, why are you mad? Why are you mad? Well, here's why they are mad. Because in the whole time this is happening, people have not been buying and trading on refined sugar. They've been getting a better deal with the Dutch. They've been smuggling sugar. So whatever numbers you have over there they have to pay, nobody cares because a lot of people don't pay it anyway. But now you've made it that they can't deal in contraband with the Dutch. And if they even try, they are definitely going to do some hard time. So it feels like they're not being trusted because they're not. And then on top of that, you have actual taxes on things after they're purchased, which didn't happen before. So you're boxed out of the Ohio River Valley. The tariffs you thought were, okay, but you had a better deal. Now you got to do those or face serious time. And then also we're going to ask you you're going to have to pay taxes on things that you need. As I tell my students all the time, looking at, the taxes on the stamp tax, I said, forget the things that there are. They're like, oh, it's all paper. I said, if I tax paper for you guys, you would be kind of upset, but most of you would just go fully digital. You wouldn't care. But what if I tax things that you needed? Like I'm going to tax all your Apple products. I'm going to tax your digital time. I'm going to tax any of your data. I'm going to triple the cost of your data. And they're just like, but you can't. There, now you see. But all I'm doing is adding little tiny taxes. But it would be bad on a regular day, but days after American colonists have sacrificed themselves to fight in the French and Indian War, been told they won, and then they're winning. It's like a game show. Tell them what they've won. They've won more taxes, more tariffs, and they've been boxed out of the Ohio River Valley. So they don't get the land. They're being controlled economically and politically. And then for someone like a Territon Harangwen, Louis Cook, he looks and goes, they're not as different than we are now. In fact, he says that, the king wants to use the American colonies for his own nursery and for his own bank, and he wants to make the colonists into slaves. And I find that quote so interesting because he could be talking about himself.
Yeah, quite literally. Yeah.
Yes, he's saying the exact same thing. When he said it, I'm sure many Indigenous people in the time would agree. I mean, I know from a fact that the Mashpee Wampanoag in that time very much are saying some of the same things, right? So yeah, so these people are no longer English. They're no longer British. American is becoming something he can work with. They're not English, and it's not all of them. Obviously, loyalists are not going to count here, but yeah, that is definitely a thing. And so that change over time is stunning, because if I give you an exam and say, Indigenous people, who are they going to side with? People would say, oh, they're going to side with the French over the English, the Americans over the French. Once I lay out actual Indigenous nations, and then you say, oh, well, the Mohawks do this and that. And then I go, yeah, except for these other Mohawks who don't do this and that.
And how would you characterize Louis Cook's motivations here? Like, is he seeking political autonomy throughout his life, and in particular during this revolutionary period? Or is this yet another instance of accommodation, which I've learned from you are two very different things? And then, of course, there's integration, which I don't think is on the table at all here. Perhaps it is, let me know. But I have to assume here he's trying to, create a space, if you will, for political autonomy. what are his motivations here? And then we'll set aside time for some questions from the audience.
I think its motivations are very similar to other indigenous actors in this period. So certainly for what's it, Thayenda Negea Joseph Brant.
Yeah,
they're, I don't say they're two sides of the same coin, but they both want similar things. And the Nende Negea, he is in a better position. He's a much better position than Atiri Turn Harangwa and Louis Cook.
Could you, for our audience, just for those who aren't aware of who Joseph Brant is, could you just tell us with which nation he's affiliated and what role he played?
Okay, then I would say that the Yende Nagea Joseph Brant, he's part of, in my mind, he's part of the team with Donegal Badonti Molly Brant.
Yeah.
She is a clan mother, which if you are not aware, people out there, that is a huge deal. So if I would say who has the most pull between them two, I would actually lean towards Molly Brant. She is the wife of, or by this time he's passed on, but she was the wife of the Indian agent, Sir William Johnson. And Joseph Brant is educated in England. He's a real up and comer, and he and Louis Cook, I'll do it that way. He and Louis Cook really, in my mind, want some of the same things for groups of people. It's just that they go about it in a coming from completely different directions. It's not surprising to me that they are never friends and always enemies. But they are both working for that. It made me think, I know people tried out Civil War a lot to talk about sort of people fighting against other people in their same demographic, but it makes me think of sort of the Civil War in England, and sort of great houses who for one reason or another sort of divided between two different monarchs. And I always saw that, as an Americanist, it's a way of sort of covering your bases. Depending on who wins, you guys will still it'll be okay. You'll still know somebody, right? And I feel that way in the Mohawks, because over time, so in the Mohawk Nation, over time, whenever something would happen, there are people, whether people join it or not, or whether Americans actually upheld their part of the bargain or not, usually not, that there's at least the possibility of having someone who knows the person in power, right? And so I think that is a thing to do. And I think that if the Ganawage leaders hadn't made the move, that they may have regretted it later, made the move to be American allies. And they are most closely linked, although not really spoken about much, with the Oneidas who fought on the side of the Americans. Like you will find the Ganawage Mohawks possibly in those same groups, in those battles, certainly in some of those battles, fighting. And I like to bring in my students, who I apparently missed more than I thought, but I did tell them, if I stop the timeline right here, the Oneidas made the best possible deal. If I cut the timeline at the end of the American Revolution, they're smart. If I roll it out into the early Republican period, they didn't win as much as they could have, but it wasn't their fault. Like they did everything on their side. But it just depends on how long that timeline runs. And if you run the timeline to today, there are still differences amongst individuals and groups within the Mohawk Nation. But I think it's interesting that when I bring this up, most people are shocked that there was ever this line. I won't call it civil war, but this line, this difference, because they can't see it now.
Yeah, but it speaks to the nature of your work, which I've learned over the past couple of months is all about this nuance and complexity. And it's really like a term we used in our last conversation over the phone was just good history, right? It's looking at the evidence as best you can with it kind of as impartially as you can and sort of letting it dictate what your story is, right? It's impossible to recollect every single fact, but you try your best. I just want to say before opening it up for questions in our remaining 10 minutes that one of the things that your work and your conversation here tonight has helped me do is to complexify and push back against what's known in the historiography as the declension narrative that follows the American Revolution and in particular, the revolutionary era into the 19th century, whereby in this case, Haudenosaunee peoples are portrayed in sort of early nationalist narratives as sort of leaving the stage, as it were, and once again are stripped of all agency in the story of how the United States becomes "quote unquote" America, right? And so I think that's something we'll return to in our third installment in the series with Alyssa Mount Pleasant, which is to sort of take that aspect of the dominant narrative and interrogate it, analyze it, break it down, and demonstrate some of the alternatives that are existing in the history. With that, Melissane, I just want to set aside a few moments here, as I say, for questions. And first question up on my list here is from certain peers of yours from the St. Lawrence University world. Greetings from Blake and Zinsun, these from Talking Wings. They are speaking tonight from the settler community of Madrid, New York, on the ancestral territory of the Mohawk Nation.
Hi,
So,
Madrid.
yes, our good friends, Blake and Zinsun. Why is it important, they ask, to utilize subaltern history, filling in the erased spaces of the master narrative, to understand the current victory of the St. Regis Mohawk tribe in federal court? And the judge stating that in New York, that New York State illegally took about 2,000 acres of land in St. Lawrence and Franklin counties from Mohawks in the 1800s. So what elements of that history should be considered in understanding the return of this land to the original stewards? In other words, how can we use this history to communicate the nuances of this story to the settler communities? So you mentioned this earlier, right? Like connecting the past with the present. That's always a dangerous thing, but that's what we do here in public history forums like this, is connect the past to the present. So that's the question from our friends in Mohawk Nation.
So it's a question, how should it be done or why should it be done?
Let's start with why it should be done.
Okay. All right. Well, history is all about context, and it's really important to supply that. I think if someone's reading those articles and saying, oh, they won what? And as far as history is concerned, the land was not contested in that way. For me, looking at what happened is really New York State trying to do an end run around the federal government.
Yeah.
There's a reason why there's so many iterations of the Not Intercourse Act that it just keeps coming up. But even with all that, even when the land is returned to its rightful place or rightful ownership or whatever, that people don't understand that Mohawk, not just Mohawk peoples, but institutions have been fighting for this for a very long time. This is not something that just started. And that the same arguments that won now were not heard before. People just weren't hearing them. And so it requires sort of this change over time, and to see that that type of advocacy never ceased. So I know you and I talked about the American Indian movement and how people sort of like to pinpoint that as like, that's when Indigenous people stood up and decided something was wrong. And that's coming a long time, and came a long time before that. And I would say too, that in all those instances with the American Indian movement, and even with the Society of the American Indian, you can find Haudenosaunee people in all of it, constantly having something to do and trying to change and get things back.
Fantastic. Oh, Melissane, I'll let folks know that when we spoke a few weeks back, we talked for about 3 hours, and I feel like I'm up for that again. I don't know about you, Melissane, but probably not. thanks so much again for a great conversation this evening. I hope to have another conversation with you soon down the line. And now I want to leave time for our ED at HNY, Sarah Oger, to make a few comments about upcoming events and other notices. Sarah?
Thank you. Thank you both for this great conversation. Melissane, thank you so much for joining us. This was absolutely fascinating. And thank you, Joe, for being Professor Schrems' conversation partner. And a big thanks to everyone who wrote in with your great questions, very thoughtful and engaging. And we enjoyed hearing some of those answers. And again, if we didn't get to you, we do apologize. And I do once again want to acknowledge our underwriter, the More Perfect Union Initiative of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Humanities New York is a 501c3 that may accept donations from government entities as well as from generous individuals like you. So thank you all and good night.